There are songs that
Mom, wait!
entertain. There are
What
songs
is
that move
it?
people.
Can I
And
come?
then, very rarely, there are
Oh,
songs that
how
do
we
something
danced
entirely
on the
different.
night we were
Songs that
wed.
arrive not
Without
from
our true
craft or
love, the
calculation,
word wasn't
but from a
said.
place so
I don't
unguarded that the act of
understand.
creating them
It's
is
not for you to
indistinguishable from the
understand.
act of being
Then
torn
what?
open. These songs do not feel like they were written. They feel like they were extracted. And the person who made them is never quite the same afterward, because making them required showing something that most human beings spend their entire lives keeping hidden: the unprocessed wound, the grief that has never been given its proper shape, the cry that has been waiting since childhood for someone to finally let it out. John Lennon made one of those songs in the autumn of 1970. Duh. I carry. He walked into a recording studio in London directly from a therapy session, sat down at the piano, and produced something that would later be described as the most emotionally naked recording ever made by a major artist. He called it Mother. And before it was released to the world, Yoko Ono, who had heard it, who loved him, who understood better than anyone what it had cost him to make it, said something that surprised him. She said, "John, you cannot release this." And John looked at her in the way he looked at people when he had already decided something, and said, "That is exactly why I have to." What happened between those two statements, the warning and the decision that overrode it, is the story of the most important creative act of John Lennon's solo career. A wound that began in the 1940s in Liverpool and was not given its proper voice until 1970, 3 decades later, on a day when a 30-year-old man finally sat down and screamed. John Winston Lennon was born on October 9, 1940, in Liverpool, to a mother named Julia Stanley and a father named Alfred Lennon. Alfred was a merchant seaman, absent for months at a time, a man whose relationship with responsibility was intermittent at best. Julia was vivid and musical and charming, and also not quite capable of providing the settled domestic life that raising a child required. The consequences of their ill-sweetness were borne, as they always are, entirely by the child. When John was approximately 5 years old, Alfred came home from sea and wanted to take John to New Zealand. Julia wanted John to stay in Liverpool. The choice was presented to the child, impossible, annihilating, and John chose his father. And then Alfred left, and John ran after his mother, and Julia walked away. John was sent to live with his mother's sister, Mimi Smith, in the house on Menlove Avenue in Woolton, that would become, for the next decade, his home. Mimi was stable, responsible, demanding, and not particularly warm. She gave John structure and security in books and the encouragement of his intellectual curiosity. She was a good parent in the functional sense, but she was not Julia. And Julia, who lived not far away, who visited sometimes, musical and funny and alive in ways that Mimi was not, remained in John's life as a tantalizing, partially present figure who gave him music and laughter and the particular love of someone who is unable to be fully responsible for another person, but is not unable to love. And then, on July 15th, 1958, Julia Lennon was struck by a car driven by an off-duty police officer as she crossed the road after visiting Mimi's house. She was killed instantly. John was 17 years old. He did not speak about it publicly for years. He did not write about it directly in the Beatles catalog. Not because the loss was absent from the music, but because the music was the container that kept the loss from becoming something he could not function around. The loss was always there, underneath everything. In the searching quality of certain songs, in the particular urgency of his creative output, in the way he could not bear abandonment in any form, and could not stop provoking the people he loved toward the point where abandonment became a possibility, as though needing to confirm that the worst thing had already happened, and he had survived it. But he never said it directly, not in the way that required him to stand in front of the thing itself and acknowledge its full dimensions. The Beatles gave him a way to feel everything while naming almost nothing specific. And for 12 years that was enough. Until it wasn't. In 1970, John Lennon encountered a book called The Primal Scream, written by American psychologist Arthur Janov. Janov's theory was that most adult neurosis could be traced to early childhood wounds that had never been properly processed. The cure was not talk therapy in the conventional sense, but something more physical and extreme, The patient was guided back to the original trauma and encouraged to experience and express it fully without suppression, including through screaming, crying, and the physical embodiment of the pain that the adult had been managing around rather than through for their entire life. John read the primal scream and experienced immediate recognition, the feeling of someone who has been trying to describe a room they have been locked in for 30 years, and has finally been handed a photograph of it. He contacted Arthur Janov directly. He and Yoko Ono flew to Los Angeles in the spring of 1970 to undergo intensive primal therapy. The therapy lasted several months, by multiple accounts, one of the most intense experiences of John's life. The process required him to return to the specific moments of early childhood abandonment that had structured his adult emotional life. The departure of his father, Alfred, the inability of his mother, Julia, to care for him consistently, and then returned to with the full force of a process designed to remove the defenses that had been managing it for 30 years. The death of Julia. The car. The officer. The 17-year-old boy who was told that his mother was gone and who had no framework, then or for a very long time afterward, for what to do with that information. John went through the therapy. He experienced what Janov described as the primal, the full, undefended return to the original pain. When he returned to England in the summer of 1970, he was different. Not healed, not resolved. The wounds of that kind do not resolve cleanly. But something had been opened that had been closed for 30 years. And John, whose instinct had always been to take what was inside him and put it into music, sat down in the autumn of 1970 and began to write what would become the John Lennon Plastic Ono Band album on Dambo. The session for Mother was not planned the way professional recording sessions are usually planned. John had been working on the album with producer Phil Spector at Abbey Road Studios, and the recording of Mother happened on a day when John arrived, having come directly from a therapy session, carrying something the session had opened, insistent and immediate, and requiring output. He sat down at the piano. He played the opening notes, a slow, sparse, deliberate sequence that sounds less like the beginning of a song and more like the beginning of a confession. There were no production flourishes, no arrangement complexities, just the piano, and in a moment, just the voice. The musicians, Klaus Vormann on bass, Ringo Starr on drums, understood from the first few bars that something different was happening. They played with a restraint that was itself a kind of honoring, getting out of the way, making space, letting the center of the recording be exactly what it was. And the center of the recording was John Lennon's voice doing something it had never done in the public record of his career. It was not singing in the technical sense. It was transmitting. The words were simple, almost shockingly so, for a man whose lyrics had always contained complexity and wit. Mother, you had me, but I never had you. Father, you left me, but I never left you. The simplicity was not poverty of expression. It was the direct result of the therapeutic process. Arthur Janov had spent months removing the defenses. What was left in the studio that morning was the feeling with nothing between it and its expression. There was a moment during the recording when John stopped playing and simply sat at the piano, his hands still on the keys, his eyes closed, his breathing audible in the room. No one spoke. No one asked if he was all right. The silence was recognized as part of the recording rather than an interruption of it. And then he continued. At the end of the song, after the bridge in which John sang goodbye to his mother and his father with a directness the Beatles format had never permitted, the song does not end the way songs usually end. It ends with John Lennon screaming. Not a musical scream, not a rock and roll scream. A human scream. A scream that comes from the place Arthur Janov had spent months trying to access. A scream that sounds exactly like what it is. A man who has been holding something for 30 years and has finally, in a recording studio in London in the autumn of 1970, let it out. Yoko Ono heard the recording. She was present for some of the session and heard the playback in the control room with John and Phil Spector. When it finished, she was quiet for a long time. Yoko Ono was not a person who was easily shaken. She had spent her life as an avant-garde artist working in deliberately difficult territory, making work that required vulnerability from herself and from others. For Yoko Ono to be shaken by something was not a trivial occurrence. She said, When she finally spoke, "John, you cannot release this." The concern behind those words was not aesthetic. She knew the recording was not bad. What she was saying was something more personal and more protective. "I have watched what making this cost you. I have watched you open the worst thing that has ever happened to you all the way, and I am not sure that releasing the result into the world, where critics can assess it, where people who do not know you will form opinions about the most private thing you have ever created, is something you can survive without it doing something permanent to you." She was saying, "This is too much of you to give away." John listened. He heard what she was saying. He understood the concern of someone who loves a person and has watched that person make themselves profoundly vulnerable, and is afraid of what the exposure might do to them. And then he said something that those who knew him recognized immediately as the truest thing he could have said in that moment. He said, "That is exactly why I have to." The reasoning behind John's decision to release Mother, and to release the entire plastic Ono Band album without softening or mediation or the commercial calculation that had governed the Beatles' output, is not difficult to reconstruct. John said it directly, in multiple interviews around the time of the album's release, with a characteristic honesty that was both his most remarkable quality and the quality that most frequently made the people around him uncomfortable. He had been performing a version of John Lennon for 12 years. Not a false version. The intelligence was real, the creativity was real, the humor was real. But a managed version. The Beatles had been the greatest vehicle for managed authenticity in the history of popular music. The songs felt personal, but were shaped and polished and produced until the personal feeling was delivered within a container that made it safe for public consumption. Even the most vulnerable moments in the Beatles' catalog were surrounded by arrangements and harmonies that held the vulnerability at a slight remove from its source. The plastic Ono Band album was John's attempt to remove that remove, to make something in which the distance between the feeling and the listener was as small as possible. Mother was the center of that project, the song in which the remove was not merely reduced but eliminated entirely. What you hear in Mother is not John Lennon, the artist, processing his grief through the machinery of his craft. What you hear is the grief itself, given a voice, given a rhythm, given the barest possible musical structure, just enough to hold it in the shape of a song without domesticating it into something other than what it was. Yoko was right that this was too much of him to give away in the ordinary sense. John agreed with her about that. What he disagreed with was the conclusion she drew from it. Because the thing Yoko was afraid of losing, the protected interior of the person she loved, was not something that needed to be protected through silence. It was something that had been damaged, slowly and continuously, by the silence itself. The scream at the end of Mother was not the release of something that had been fine. It was the release of something that had been accumulating under pressure for 3 decades. He had to release it because keeping it would have been the continuation of the thing that had been harming him since he was 5 years old. The abandonment had taken his voice, not the singing voice, but the voice that could say the specific, unmediated truth about what had happened and what it had cost. Releasing Mother was an act of reclamation. The John Lennon Plastic Ono Band album was released on December 11, 1970. The critical response was not unanimous. Some reviewers found the album's emotional nakedness too raw, too unmediated, the artistic equivalent of someone crying in public in a way that makes the observer uncomfortable rather than moved. Mother, in particular, with its sparse arrangement and its screaming finale, divided listeners sharply between those who experienced it as a revelation and those who found it difficult to listen to at all. But something else happened alongside the divided critical response. The people who heard Mother and were shaken by it, who experienced it not as difficult but as necessary, felt something that recorded music rarely produces. They felt less alone. Not because the song described their specific circumstances, but because the song demonstrated, with a force that no carefully managed piece of music could have achieved, that the wound was speakable, that the thing sitting in silence could be given a sound, could be given words, could be released into the air in the presence of witnesses who would receive it without requiring it to be anything other than what it was. John had been afraid that releasing the recording would make him permanently vulnerable. What he discovered instead was that the vulnerability, once given its proper expression, did not diminish him. It completed something. It closed a circuit that had been open since the road in Liverpool in 1958, Not by resolving the loss. Julia Lennon was gone and would always be gone. But by finally, at 30 years old, giving the loss its proper name and its proper sound in the presence of the world. Yoko had been right that it was too much of him to give away, and John had been right that it had to be given. Ringo Starr was behind the drum kit for the recording of Mother. He has spoken about the session in various interviews over the decades, always with the careful understatement that is one of his most consistent qualities. He has said that playing on Mother required a different kind of listening. Not listening for musical cues or technical coordination, but listening to a person in the way you listen to someone who is telling you something important and needs you to stay absolutely still while they say it. When the screaming at the end happened, when John's voice crossed from singing into something that was not singing, that was not any category of musical performance he had a name for. Ringo kept playing, not because the song required him to, because stopping would have been wrong. Because the drum beat underneath the scream was the one thing holding the structure of the song in place while John was somewhere else entirely, somewhere the song could barely contain him, and the structure needed to hold. Ringo has said, "I have never played on anything like that before or since." It was not a recording session in the usual sense. It was something you witnessed and tried to be useful in the middle of. You did not talk about it afterward. You just went home. John gave interviews around the time of the album's release that were unlike any he had given before. The managed persona, the witty, provocative, carefully controlled public version of John Lennon that had been the product the machine delivered for a decade, was gone. In its place was something journalists found simultaneously compelling and disorienting, a man speaking about his own interior life with a directness that left no room for the usual mediating distance of the celebrity interview. He talked about his mother, Julia. He talked about his father, Alfred. He talked about Arthur Janov and the therapy. He said, in one interview that became particularly noted, that he had spent 12 years being John Lennon for other people and was only now, at 30, beginning to discover what it might mean to be John Lennon for himself. The response from the public was not what the response from some critics had been. The letters that came, in quantities that surprised even John, were not the letters of people who found the album difficult. They were the letters of people who had been waiting, without knowing they had been waiting, for someone to say the thing that Mother said. Letters from people who had lost parents. Letters from people who had been abandoned. Letters from people who had spent years managing wounds, and had heard in John's scream the sound of permission. Permission to feel the thing fully, to stop protecting the people who had caused the pain from the consequences of having caused it. Yoko Ono read some of those letters. Those who were around her during that period have noted that her position on the question, whether releasing Mother had been the right decision, shifted quietly in the face of what it produced in the people who heard it. Julia Lennon never heard her son sing about her. She was gone 12 years before he found the language. The irony that the song required her death to be written, that the full expression of what she meant to him required the distance that her absence created, is one of the specific sorrows of John Lennon's story that time has not made easier to consider. There is a version of John Lennon's life in which Julia does not cross the road on July 15, 1958, in which she lives, in which she is present for the Beatles' years, for the birth of Julian, in which the wound that structured John's emotional life is not the wound of her death, but something smaller, something that might have found its expression in a different kind of song. In that version, Mother is never written, and the world never hears the scream at the end of the recording that became, for millions of people, the sound of their own unspoken grief, given its proper voice. But Julia did cross the road, and John was 17. There is no way to be grateful for the loss that produced the music without also being horrified by the loss. Both things are true, simultaneously. This is one of the things that art, at its most honest, refuses to resolve. What John Lennon gave the world with Mother, and with the plastic Ono Band album, and with the decision to release it over Yoko Ono's warning, was not simply a recording. It was permission. Permission to feel the wound directly, rather than around its edges. Permission to name the people who had caused the pain without protecting them from the naming. Permission to scream, literally if necessary, at the thing that had been sitting in silence. Permission to be 30 years old and still be, in the specific and unresolvable sense, the child who was left behind on a Liverpool street in the 1940s and never fully recovered from it, and to say so in public without shame. John Lennon had been one of the most famous people on earth for a decade by the time he made Mother. He had access to every form of protection from vulnerability that fame and money can provide. He chose to make himself maximally vulnerable instead. He chose to take the thing that had been at the center of everything he had ever made and give it its full, unmediated, unprotected voice. Yoko Ono had told him not to. She had told him not to because she loved him and understood, better than almost anyone, what the exposure would require. And John had looked at her and said, "That is exactly why I have to." That exchange, the warning and the decision that overrode it, is perhaps the most important creative moment of John Lennon's solo career, because the album that came from it, and the song at its heart, did not merely demonstrate what John Lennon was capable of. It demonstrated what art is for. Not entertainment, not expression in the casual sense. Art is for the thing Mother did, taking the wound that has been in silence for 30 years and giving it a sound that can be heard by the people who are carrying the same wound in their own silence, so that those people know that the thing they have been alone with was never, in fact, something they were alone with at all. John Lennon screamed in a recording studio in London in the autumn of 1970. The scream has never stopped, and it never will.